Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to install Fedora 39 as a virtual machine running using VMware Workstation. Now, if you don't already have VMware Workstation, you can download it, install it, and go ahead and open it up. It'll be prompting you with three buttons. One is to create a new virtual machine, one is to open a virtual machine, and one is to connect to a remote server. We're going to be using the Create a New Virtual Machine button here, but before we click it, let's go ahead and download the image of the virtual machine that we want to use. And in this case, we're going to use Fedora 39. So use your favorite search engine and search for Fedora Workstation. You'll see a link that is for fedoraproject.org, and it'll take you to the latest version of downloading Fedora. In our case, the latest version of Fedora is Fedora Workstation 39, and we just want an ISO file, right? So you can go to the section here that says just want an ISO file, find your architecture for your system. For example, I'm running AMD x86-64, and then click the download button there. Once you have the ISO, you should save it in a pretty stable location. So I use Documents ISOs for where I save all my ISOs, and you'll see that I have the Fedora Workstation ISO right here. Now that I have that, let's go back to VMware Workstation, and we'll go ahead and create a new virtual machine. So we'll click this button. We'll be prompted with the new virtual machine wizard. Typically, you would use the typical setting and run right through it if you don't really care about like modifying the defaults or changing things to your needs. But since we're professionals here and we want to understand the choices that we're making and what they do, we're going to click custom and we're going to run through all of the component options here and explain them. Go ahead and click next, and then it'll prompt you for what hardware compatibility that you would like to use for your virtual machine. Now, the hardware compatibility is just there so that if you install virtual machines with one version of VMware Workstation, that you can move it to other versions with compatibility. In my case, I only have one instance of VMware Workstation, and it's running on my machine here. And I'm not going to be exporting or migrating these VMs anywhere else. So I'm going to choose the highest compatibility. But if you had multiple machines with multiple versions of VMware Workstation and you wanted to be able to move those VMs and migrate them across them, you would choose the lowest common denominator version of all the versions that you have. That way you can have safe compatibility to move things around. But in our case, it's just me. I'm the only one using VMware Workstation for my purposes. I'm going to choose the highest compatibility. Then you go ahead and click next. It'll ask you where the ISO image that you downloaded is, because it wants to know what image you want to use for this virtual machine. You'll click the disk image file button here, click browse, and browse to your ISO and open it up. And you're basically just saying, I would like this VM to use this ISO file to install the virtual machine operating system. Then you'll click next. Then it's going to prompt you for a name for your virtual machine. The name's up to you. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It has nothing to do with the host name of the virtual machine that we're going to create. It's just a name for you to identify the VM when you're looking at it in VMware Workstation. Similar to the name that I have on the left here, Quantum Realm. That's a name of another virtual machine that I created. So in this case, I'm just going to call it Fedora Workstation and click next, but feel free to call it whatever you'd like. Then VMware Workstation will ask you what CPU configuration would you like to do for this virtual machine. And it's basically just two inputs here. It's going to be the sockets and the cores per socket. So in this case, generally speaking, you're going to leave sockets usually one, right? The number of processors is always going to be one socket. If you need to increase this, it would be because you have some sort of specialized requirement for your software. Maybe you're writing software that like checks whether you have multiple sockets in your machine or not. But generally speaking, you're going to leave this to one. And you're just going to change, if you want to increase the CPU, you'll do it with the cores per processor. So for example, if I want to give my VM like 2 vCPUs, I'll click 2. And I say vCPUs because my actual physical processor in my machine has 32 threads, and I can use those threads and dedicate them to this virtual machine as like a virtual core, right? A vCPU, that is. In my case, I have a Ryzen 5950X, which has 32 threads, so I can use up to 32, vCPUs for this machine. But I'm going to keep it at 4, which is like large enough to be a quite performant virtual machine, but low enough that it's not really going to bother my underlying host Windows machine. All right, so now I have 4 processor cores, or we like to call that 4 vCPUs, virtual CPUs. Then it's going to prompt you for the amount of RAM or memory that you're going to want to give your virtual machine. Again, I have a pretty beefy machine here. I have 128 gigs of RAM on my host. And so I can be pretty generous here. I can give my virtual machine like 16 gigabytes of RAM here if I wanted to, or even higher. But if you have a machine that's like 32 gigs at your host, maybe you want to jump that down a little bit and maybe give your VM only 8 gigs of RAM, right? Size it appropriately depending on your hardware, but remember that each operating system that you install has a different minimum requirements for its CPU and RAM, right? And you'll see here that VMware's telling me like, hey, you're installing Fedora. I recommend at least like 1 GB minimum, but I recommend if you have it, 2 GB. I'm gonna give it 8 just because I have it. You choose the number that's right for you. Then it's going to prompt you for the network configuration, the network type that you want to give this virtual machine. And there's 4 primary options here: bridged, NAT, host only, and no network at all. No network at all is pretty self-explanatory, but let's explain the rest real quick, just so you understand like what you're choosing when you select one of these. Bridged networking, this is for when you want your virtual machine to appear as a host on your actual network that your host is attached to. So for example, my Windows PC is plugged into my switch somewhere. If I wanted my VM to appear as if it's like an adjacent system on that network, I would use bridge networking. So it's as if I took my virtual machine and plugged it into my switch as well, right? But we can't do that because it's a virtual machine. But you get what I'm saying. That's the type of connectivity you're going to get. Your VM will get an IP address at the same level that your host is getting an IP address, right? So from your router or whatever you have at home. That's pretty good if you want like your VM to act as if like a peer on the network, right? Like as a peer with other hosts on the network. If you select NAT, you're basically saying to your virtual machine, you're going to use the host machine, which is my Windows machine, as a router, and you're going to route your stuff, your traffic out that way. So that's basically like turning your Windows machine into a router. The virtual machine is like a guest on that network, and that's how traffic gets routed. This is a really good network type for default like installations because it gives you access to the internet, right? It allows your VM to go out to the internet. So does bridged, but I didn't like talk about that. But NAT gives your machine access to like go out the same internet path that your host goes out, but it keeps the actual networking private to the VM. So you have this like weird inflection point where your host is now the router, but your host can actually connect to your VM, but the VM, like other hosts on the network, could not connect to the VM. So it's a pretty cool network setup here. This is what most people are going to recommend to use by default. And then you have host only network, where it's just a private network between your host and the VM. Your VM no longer has the ability to get out to the internet using like NAT or bridged. It's just a private network that only your host and the VM can talk to one another. So different use cases for different things. You would use bridge if you want your VM to appear as a peer on their network that your host is. You'd use NAT if you want your VM to have a private network, but also reach the internet as well, but also just reach your host, right? Not any other host, just this one host. And then you would use host only, no internet access, just ability to communicate with the host. We're going to choose NAT here because it's the most flexible for our needs at this point in time. And click next. Then it's going to ask you to select a IO controller type. Now, it's going to say that LSI logic is recommended, but really Power Virtualized SCSI is actually the best that you can choose given these 4 options. It's the most optimized and efficient based on using virtual machines. If you have the option for Parallelized SCSI, definitely use it and ignore what VMware says to use LSI logic here, because Power Virtualized is much better throughput performance. Then click next. It's going to ask you for the type of disk that you want to use. Since my VMware installation is on an NVMe drive on my Windows host, I'm going to use NVMe here. But if your installation was on maybe a SATA SSD or something different, you choose the appropriate type here. But I'll keep NVMe for my selection. Then it's going to want to ask to create a new virtual disk. So the actual virtual machine that you're running needs its own hard drive, right? But it can't use your own hard drive, right? If you told it to use an entire physical disk, you can't, because your physical disk is already being used by Windows, unless you bought like a separate physical disk and gave it just to your virtual machine. But that's kind of impractical depending on what you're doing, right? We also don't have an existing virtual disk because this is a brand new virtual machine that we want to create from scratch. So we're gonna have to create a new virtual disk, and all a new virtual disk is gonna be some file somewhere on your machine that acts as a virtual hard drive for your virtual machine. So click create a new virtual machine, or sorry, create a new virtual disk and click next. Then you'll want to give that virtual disk a size. Again, the recommended size is listed here, 20 gigabytes. You can go higher or lower depending on how much space you have on your system. But the options below are kind of important depending on what your use case is. There's this checkbox here saying to allocate all disk space now or to not do that. If you leave it unchecked, VMware will just allocate enough space for the VM as needed, right? So as more space is needed, it'll continue to allocate the space until it reaches this maximum size of like 20 gigs. So for example, if I had 20 gigs here and I left this unchecked, my virtual machine will install, and let's say the install only used about 2 gigabytes of data, it'll create the 2 gigabytes of data in my virtual disk and nothing more. As I added more data to my virtual machine, VMware will continue to allocate more disk space for me. So like 4 gigs, 10 gigs, 15 gigs. And then when it got up to 20 gigs, my disk will be full and VMware will no longer allocate disk space. So you can see that it allocates space as it needs to be used, right? So we call that thin provisioning, right? So we're provisioning space for your virtual machine, but thinly, just enough space we need at the time. As we need more space, we get more space up until a maximum size. But if you check this box and you say allocate all the disk space now, all 20 gigabytes will be allocated on the underlying disk for you and ready to use, right? So it'll take the disk space now. Even if you're not using it in the virtual machine, it'll take the disk space now and allocate it. This can be more performant because the disk space is already there and VMware doesn't have to like reach out to the disk to allocate some more like dynamically at runtime. But if you don't have the space, you might not want to use this. So it depends. I like my VMs to be pretty performant and I have the disk space for it, so I checked this box. Then you're given another option to either store the virtual hard disk as a single file or split it up into multiple files. Now, it might sound like splitting up into multiple files makes things a little bit more manageable, but that option was really there for file systems that had a limit on the size of a single file, right? Like they were like fat file system, FAT32, I think, had a limit of 4 gigabytes for a single file. And so this option was there to overcome that limit, but still maintain a single like a virtual hard drive. I don't really ever use this anymore since all modern file systems support very large single files. So I click store virtual disk as a single file. Plus, it helps with performance when you have larger disks because it's easier to work with a single file than to manage data across multiple files. So this is my general recommended setup that I do is I give it a size, I check allocate all disk space, and I also say store as a single file. Again, now you have the knowledge to choose for yourself, but this is what I choose. Then you want to give the disk file a name. Again, this really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but whatever you gave your virtual machine name, that's what's going to default here. So if you called your virtual machine foo, you would see foo here. But since I called mine Fedora Workstation, I see Fedora Workstation. Then you can click next. At this point, you are ready to create the virtual machine and start installing the operating system. And you'll see this like a little checkbox saying like power this on after creation. So if you were to hit finish right now, the virtual machine will power on and you'll start to see its UI. Or you can click this customize hardware box to see what other options you have. I'm going to click this because there's actually one important option that I want to cover just specific to Fedora 39 at the time of this video. So when I click customize hardware, it brings me to basically all of the selections that I selected throughout the wizard, right? The amounts of memory, the processor configuration, the ISO file that I'm using, the network type that I chose. Then it shows me other things that I didn't get to select, like the USB controller, the sound card, and the display. USB controller, you can leave compatibility 2.0. You can raise it to 3.1 if you're using 3.1 devices, whatever you'd like. Sound card, you can leave it. It'll pipe through your host audio if possible. But display, I want to uncheck this accelerate 3D graphics. And the reason why I want to do that is because Fedora 39 has a bug in the latest Mesa packages that when this accelerate 3D graphics checkbox is checked, and you update Fedora to the latest Mesa version, like Mesa package, you'll just get a black screen when you boot up the VM. So I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to have you all deal with that. Until they fix that bug, I'm going to leave this unchecked, and then I'll come back to it, like in my personal time, I'll come back to it when they fix this for good. So I'll just uncheck that and click close. And then now I'm ready to start the VM and install the operating system. So I'll make sure that the power on is checked and hit finish. Now you'll see VMware is going to create your disk file depending on how large you made the disk and whether or not you chose to allocate all the space now. That might take a little time to finish. Great. And now you'll see that the VM is actually started up. I see the UI, but it's a little small. So I'll click this free stretch button up here to get the UI to stretch. When I click inside the UI window, my mouse gets captured, and now I have to use the arrow keys to go up and down, right? So my mouse is captured. I can no longer move my mouse. If I wanted to release the capture of my mouse, in the very, very bottom left corner of VMware, you'll see like what buttons you need to press that. For me, it's Control Alt. If I press Control Alt, I have my mouse back. Okay, I'm gonna click back into the VM, use my arrow keys to highlight Start Fedora, and click Enter. Now, VMware will be reading your ISO image and starting Fedora. This may take a little while depending on your hardware, so we'll give some time. Once the UI is loaded, you'll see this beautiful Welcome to Fedora sign. You can go ahead and click into it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually click this Enter Full Screen Mode button up here, just so that I can make the VM's screen large and full screen, and we can see everything pretty nicely. So now that you're booted into Fedora, and you have options here, you can install Fedora, or you can click Not Now and like use Fedora as a live system and play around with it, like try it before you buy it. But we know we want to buy it, so we're going to install Fedora. And I say buy it, it's free, but you know what I mean, like the metaphor. So we're going to click Install Fedora. The actual installation UI will now appear, and it'll allow us to choose different options for our installation. First option is going to be language. Pick the language that's relevant to you and click Continue on the bottom right. Then you'll be prompted for localization options and system options. Localization options will be your keyboard layout and the date and time. You shouldn't have to touch them. Date and time, if it's not the right time zone, just click in there and find your time zone and click it on the map, and then click Done when you're ready. If you want to, on the top right here, the network time, you can click that and make sure it's enabled. That way your system will use network time rather than a static time. It's good to keep time in sync. Then click Done for that. Then we want to use the system settings. There's only one setting to manage here, and it's the destination and the partition layout that we want to use for the disk. So again, we're professionals here. We want to really understand what options we have available to us. We're going to be using Btrfs or Btrfs as our file system here, not because it's any objectively better or worse than anything else, but because when I first tried to install Fedora using Btrfs, I was kind of confused at where to go. And now that I kind of know how to lay it out, I want to just show you all. So I'm going to click the advanced custom storage configuration here. That gives me the most flexibility to choose the file system layout that I want. Make sure your VMware disk is checked, right? See, if I uncheck it, it'll go away and it'll give me a yellow bar, but make sure it's checked, make sure advanced custom is checked, and hit Done. It'll bring you into the advanced custom configuration UI. And now we have that 20 gigabyte disk, and we're ready to partition it up into different, partitions and file systems. So the very, very first thing we need here is we're going to need a boot partition. We're going to need a BIOS boot partition. So we're going to create a new partition of type partition, actually. The file system will be BIOS boot. We will make it the max size of 2 megabytes that's supported. And this partition is necessary so that when the VMware Workstation boots up your VM, it knows how to find the OS and stuff for your VM, right? The bootloader and all that good stuff. Once you have that, let's create another partition. And this is also going to be of type partition. Its size is going to be 2 gigabytes, and the file system will be ext4, and the mount point will be /boot. Now this partition is going to hold the Linux kernel and other boot information that's needed for Linux to boot, right? Basically, really just the Linux kernel images are going to get stored there. But we put that on a separate partition and a separate mount point so that it has its own space not interrupted by the rest of the file system, right? So this is a dedicated 2 gigabytes for the Linux kernels and stuff. That way we prevent like, using a lot of disk from making the machine not boot and stuff. With the remaining free space, we're going to create the Btrfs volume. So we'll click add a new device, use the type will be Btrfs volume. We'll use all 18 gigs, no name, no mount point, and we'll just hit OK. If you want to encrypt the disk, you can select this encrypt button. I'll actually show you, that way it's there. You can encrypt your entire disk here, or actually just this Btrfs volume technically, and give it encryption type of LUX2. Use that, it's more secure. Leave the sector size automatic, and then do your password. You choose your password, I'll choose my password. And then now we're encrypting that Btrfs volume. Great, once that's created, you'll see that the Btrfs volume is there. And on the sidebar, a new option has shown up, right? Btrfs volumes. We'll go ahead and click that, because even though we have the BIOS boot partition, the /boot mount point for like the Linux kernel and stuff, we still don't have a file system for our OS. So we need to create that. So we'll go ahead and create a new Btrfs Subvolume now. We'll give it a name of a mount point of /, which is root, and that will be our subvolume for the root file system. We'll go ahead and create one more Btrfs subvolume called @home. We'll mount it at /home, and that'll be for our home directories and such. Now our file system layout is complete. We have 3 partitions, or essentially, 3 partitions, 1 BIOS boot partition, 1 ext4 partition for /boot for the Linux kernel, 1 Btrfs volume using the rest of the space. In that Btrfs volume, we have 2 subvolumes. One is for the /root file system, and one is for /home file system. With all of that done, and the reason why I chose the @ symbol and the @home symbol for the names for the subvolumes is there's no specific reason other than to be consistent with what you would get if you went with Ubuntu or some other out of the box installer. This name could have been whatever I want it to be. It did not have to be the @ symbol. I'm just choosing it to be consistent with a default Ubuntu install that chooses Btrfs. Okay. And plus I didn't know how to get this set up when I first installed Fedora, how to install a Btrfs volume with 2 subvolumes. I didn't know how to do this, but I want to show you all. Now that you're done and you're happy with all this, you can click done. It'll print all of the operations that it wants to do for your disk. If you like what you see here, you can click accept changes. And now that that's done, you can click begin installation. And your installer will now be actually written to disk, right? So we'll partition that disk, create all of the things that we need, and then start reading the data from the ISO file and writing it to our operating system disk. We are now installing the operating system. And again, depending on your specifications for your virtual machine and your underlying host hardware that you're installing on, this can take anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. So we'll let this run and we will come back to it when it's done. But now that this is finished, you can go ahead and click finish installation. And this will just take you back to the UI. Let's go to the very top here and unselect full screen so we can see Fedora Workstation and VMware Workstation again. And now let's just turn off the VM. So from within the UI of the VM, we'll click the power button and power off. And now the VM will power it down. It's finished installing the operating system. But before we power it back on, we need to edit the virtual machine settings, and we need to remove the ISO file from the VM so that way it's not mounted again. And all we'll do is just uncheck this connect that power on box and hit OK. Now the ISO will no longer be there, and we can power on the virtual machine. And then you'll see a password prompt comes up. This is that password that you used to encrypt that Btrfs volume. So you go ahead and enter that. And you'll need this every time you start the virtual machine because the file system is encrypted now. So when it tries to boot into your file system, your root file system, it'll need an encryption password. And I do that for safety reasons, right? I don't want someone to come up to my machine and start my VMs and do whatever they want with them. I mean, my machine should be locked, but in the case it's not, right? So you'll be greeted with the Fedora Linux setup. So I'll go ahead and again make this full screen so we can go into the machine, and I will click Start Setup. And the privacy settings are up to you. I disable automatic problem reporting. I leave location services on though. I enable third-party repositories. You don't have to if you don't like, but it's pretty good too. And then you can connect your online accounts like Google or whatever. I don't want to connect anything, so I'll click skip. And then I'll give myself a name and username. Then it'll prompt me for a password. Use whatever password you want, and I'll use whatever password I want. And then now I have my machine with my user set up. I click start using Fedora. If you wait a second, it will switch to your new account and give you the tour if you'd like. I'm not going to take the tour here. I'll click no thanks. And now I'm in Fedora and I can use it. And one of the things I usually do off the bat is I go to display settings, and I like to use my VMs in full screen mode if I'm like using them from the UI. And I'll give the VM screen resolution the native resolution of whatever monitor I'm using. So I'll give it the 4K resolution, zoom it to 200%. And now we have a beautiful, beautiful, crisp VM. Nice, new, freshly installed Fedora workstation. If I click the meta key, the Windows key, and use type terminal, you can get a terminal emulator. And now just to show you, like, here is the terminal emulator. I'll make it a little bigger for you. And if I cat etc os -release, we are running Fedora. Okay, now that we're done, you can go ahead and power it down, and you can use this machine however you want. I just wanted to show you how to install it, so I'm gonna go ahead and power this down. And now get out of the full screen mode again, and we are done installing Fedora. So congratulations, you did it, and now you know what you did. So you didn't just like run through an installation blindly. You know what the options that you selected, what they do, what they are. So again, thank you for this, and I will see you in the next one.